Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Kindred. Kindred is a 1979 novel by Octavia Butler that blends science fiction with historical fiction by combining time travel with slave narratives. Dana is a Black woman who is a writer living in Los Angeles. She suddenly finds herself being transported back and forth between the then present and a plantation in Maryland before the Civil War. During her travels to the past, Dana meets ancestors, both enslaved and slave owners, at different points in their lives. In efforts to ensure that she will exist in the future, Dana tries to balance navigating antebellum society with attempting to have a positive influence on her ancestors. I started reading Kindred with a basic understanding of what the book was about, having read summaries. I'm not really into sci-fi books or movies, but having read reviews that mentioned that the book was really good, I thought, it might be worth checking out and trying something new. The book opens up, and from the outset, I was like, okay, this is a little bit different. But you kind of launch right into it. There's no preamble. From the very beginning, pretty much as the story begins, the main character, Dana, is launched into this episode of time travel, which plays a huge role throughout the rest of the book. I will say, she meets this young boy, Rufus, who is, turns out to be her ancestor back in the past. During their first meeting, he's a little boy. By the second meeting, I was like, this kid obviously has a death wish. And it might be politically incorrect to say, close your ears if it offends, but it might have been a good idea to just let this kid take one for the team, because he just seems to be a bag of worries. I cannot imagine a child getting into so much life-threatening danger. So, she rescues him the first time from drowning. The second time she rescues him, it's because he's, set fire to some drapes in the house because he stole money from his father, and his father accused him of stealing the money. This kid just sounds like he's on his way to becoming a serial killer, or whatever the equivalent was at that time. He tells a story of having burnt down the stable because he wanted a horse, and his dad sold it to someone for money. I was like, this child sounds like he's going to be a problem, because he's a problem already. Initially, I was like, okay, I don't know what to make of this kid. You might just have to let that one go. But during the second rescue, where she leaves the family home and makes her way into the woods to seek safety in the cabin of a nearby free woman, this woman is the mother to Alice, who through conversation with Rufus, she comes to believe might be an ancestor of hers. The exchange that they have at the cabin that she sees is a little bit dramatic, but quite harrowing. With her figuring out what's going on with the time travel, how it works and whatnot, initially it seemed a little bit like Lifetime movie-ish. But when she got to the cabin and, is moving about in the middle of the night, she witnesses the confrontation, an incident between patrollers and the adults in Alice's home. While Dana is witnessing this, her imagining what it might have been like, right? I've read slave narratives. I've read books about slavery that take place during slavery, also the accounts of people that lived through those things. But here, this felt real and visceral. Reading Octavia Butler's description, I've read things like this in book, I've seen things like this in movie, but somehow her conveyance of this person being out here in the middle of the woods, witnessing this scene as a bystander, I felt like I was in the woods next to Dana watching it take place. And the stream of emotions that she was feeling, being terrified and uneasy, I realized the connection that people felt in reading Octavia Butler's writing. The way that I would describe it is that Dana, the main character, goes back and forth between what was then the present, right, which was 1976 to the early 1800s, and she then moves through the years. As she's coming to the realization about where she is, the time and whatnot, it affects the manner in which she has to conduct herself. But she makes observations along the way. It's as someone that reads a lot of books about Black history, studies a lot about Black history, I'm familiar with some of the things that she explains. But I think for someone that comes to the book from the perspective of just having an interest in fiction or science fiction specifically, but not necessarily Black history, by Dana having to adjust to being back in time, having to adapt to a different time period and the various issues that comes along with it, it's used as an opportunity to educate the reader about the experience of being enslaved, the social norms and practices. And speaking to the young boy Rufus, who's a young white boy, his family owned slaves, it's customary for him, due to his father, his upbringing, the time, to use the N-word when referring to Black people. That's shocking to Dana because by the time she's alive, it's a taboo word, right? It's a word preferred not used in polite company. And with the two of them adjusting to expectations of each other's time, like teaching each other, they offer explanations back and forth, slave states versus free states, expectations about how things are supposed to function. For someone that might be unfamiliar with history or unfamiliar with the institution of slavery, the book, it doesn't just drop you into the story and leave you to figure things out on your own. Instead, things are explained along the way. Context is given. In her current life, Dina is married to a man named Kevin, who's a white man. And so there's some background provided on how they met and how their relationship formed, their current marriage. He actually bears witness to her being launched into this time travel because they live together in this house, right? She disappears and reappears seemingly seconds, and over time, the amount of time expands to minutes and then longer. And so in the first two instances of this happening, she's transported back into the past by herself. But on the third instance, he has the foresight to pack a bag, and in hopes that sort of with things that she might need in this other world that might be helpful. And so during this time travel incident, the second one, she found herself in quite a bit of trouble, which she relays to him. The damage that she suffers during that time, or the injuries rather, they still affect her when she comes back to the present. So he had the idea that to help keep her safe, because each time she goes back, bad things happen to her, right, because of her race. And then also the circumstances of this, she can get herself into problems. Each time she goes back to the past, there's like increasing danger or potential for her being harmed becomes greater. She starts to realize the oncoming feeling that occurs before she's going to be transported. And so with that, she grabs the bag, he grabs hold of her, and with that, the two of them along with this bag go back into the past. So Dana comes to realize that this kid Rufus is going to be one of her ancestors. And the woman that he has children with, a black woman, is also going to be an ancestor of her. This is one of the women on the plantation. They would give birth to an ancestor she knew, like her great-grandmother or something like that. There's a family member, there's a family Bible that lists ancestors going back to the 1800s. And so in realizing that if anything happens to this kid, it might then have an effect on her and her future, right? Like she might not come into existence. So in going back and meeting him, his family, these are people of the time at that point. He's still fairly young, so he hasn't fully come into the experience of being white and privileged at this point in time. He still lives on his father's plantation, and his father is a very harsh man. His mother is like a helicopter parent. And with these two dysfunctional people, you can see the impact they're having on him. He's young, so he isn't given full run of his authority as yet, but he knows some of the social norms and expectations and begins to carry them out, or rather insists on them being carried out with Dana. So this with regards to her referring to him as sir or using some other title rather than just calling him by his first name. Like he's already being trained as to how, as a white man, he's supposed to be treated by slaves or anyone else black in general. So Dana ends up having quite a bit of contact with the people around Rufus. She meets some of the other slaves on the plantation. She meets his mother, his father, and whatnot. And this becomes dangerous because her knowledge of social norms are based on what she's read in books and learned in passing. For all intents and purposes, she has to rely on remembering to observe these things, right? Not being a product of that time. It doesn't come natural to her. She hasn't been living her life in this way. One of the benefits is that in this instance, when Kevin, her husband, has been transported back to her, him being a white man provides some degree of a shield. They come up with this cover story of her being his property. And so because even in the manner that she speaks, she's a woman from California. She has formal education, actually some advanced education. And so a lot of people back in the past, they make note of the manner in which she speaks. And adding to that, she works around this by explaining herself as being a free person from the state of New York. But yet there's some discomfort with her even being in the area. So on her own, she might not have been welcomed. But in the presence of Kevin, you can sense that there's still some tension and unease about her being around. But because of her being perceived as his property, it kind of stays their hand. But there's still some expectation on the part of the people in the past for her to observe these social norms. So there's this tension between what they expect and how she conducts herself, what comes naturally to her. There's this looming threat of danger because one false step or mistake, and she can end up being the victim of some act of violence. In addition to trying to keep this kid physically safe, Dana realizes that growing up in this environment, as one of the slaves points out, he's not too bad at this point because he's still a kid. So it's not quite too late for him. But as he gets older, especially when they begin preparing him to take control of this plantation one day, there's a chance that he's going to become, especially with parents like his mother and father, he's going to become very much like them. So Dana takes it as her responsibility to try to make him better than his parents. They're not very educated, and thus he's not very educated. So it's convenient that when Kevin comes along, he's able to serve as a tutor. And with that, they hatch this plan to also improve him in other ways, or to attempt to, so that he won't be like his parents. Dana has this idea that she could do some good by helping Rufus avoid becoming like his parents, but also in helping some of the slave children learn how to read and write. Because they don't know how long they're going to be stuck back in this time, they start to put effort into assimilating into the society. So they have this cover story of him being a writer, her being a slave that he's purchased, and him now traveling through the South. And in keeping with that, it gives them an excuse to stay at the plantation without drawing too much attention, or at least not initially. But in time, it becomes obvious that Dana is somewhat educated, that she can read, which makes the slave master and his wife, Rufus's dad, and his mother very uncomfortable. So Dana hatches this plan that maybe through Rufus, given that she saved his life, it should give her a bit of leverage with him. So she takes up reading to him and whatnot, spending time with him. And it seems like because he's so young, he's still playing with the slave children, and he doesn't quite give them a hard time like his dad might, right? As he hasn't been given full run of his privileges. But there's some indication that he can go either way. At least early on in the book, one of the unknown points is, can Dana's influence caused him to take a path different from the path of those around him, this path that his parents are attempting to set him on. It's not a matter of nature, because we see that he's still young. He's not quite as bad as his parents. Much of his ideology and the way he conducts himself comes from the example that they're setting as far as how he's supposed to behave with regards to other people. But Dana hopes that having saved his life and then having this bond, that hopefully she might be able to steer him away from following the path of his parents, going against the social norms of the time to be more evolved and progressive. So she tries to correct some of the things that he's doing wrong, educating him, but it's kind of undermined. And it's like a source of tension within the story, because you start to see some of the habits and practices of his father being present in him as well, especially during one particular exchange that Dana bears witness to between him and his mother, where he shows himself as being fully capable, of having much the same temper and attitude of his father. Dana notes that under normal circumstances, like when he's calm, Rufus looks like his mother. He favors his mother physically, but when enraged, when angered, he takes on the features of his father are more prominent. His attitude and demeanor becomes a lot like his father. It gives rise to this question of, as the child gets older, what's going to be a stronger influence on him? The natural tendency for people to be decent, or the social influences around him? And living in this time, Dana and Kevin, him being a white man and her being a black woman, they have to adopt these cover stories that would allow them to stay on the plantation. And over time, they end up getting wrapped up in everyday life. What's surprising to them, or to Dana rather, is just how easily, despite them being from the 1970s, just by being in this environment, they too adapt to the norms and customs and the flow of everyday life. That they, as these people from the future, from a completely different time, growing up under a completely different set of social rules and expectations, when dropped into this environment, they themselves, they start out like just playing into this cover story, but they find themselves getting drawn into the everyday life and practices of the time. It begs the question of, if you can come from the future and you're now in the past and you can still be affected by those social norms, how would you, or how realistic is it that coming from the future, you could expect to have influence over this young man, that coming of age, you'd be able to steer him away from the social norms of his time. Dana and Kevin go back into the past and they interact with Rufus as well as these other characters. But the characters don't come into the future. The characters from the past, they don't come into the future. These characters from the 1800s, it's like the time travel only works one way, with Dana going back to the past, but not Rufus coming into the future. So it's like, if you go back to that time, you have to adapt to the period. How realistic is it that you're going to be able to have a greater influence over this kid than the environment he's spending his time in and day out, when you, just by being from the future, you're just in the environment for what ends up being like a few weeks or so. You're having to change and mold yourself to fit expectations that you're having a hard time holding on to who and what you are in your day-to-day life in the present, right? At the same time, you're telling this story years back into the past, right? There's some snapshots of Dana's life with Kevin. So like how they met early in their relationship back in the 70s, in what was then modern times. Dana recounts them meeting, and at the time they had quite a bit in common, which is sort of what brought them together. They're both writers or aspiring writers, and they're following paths that their families don't exactly want for them. There's a flashback to early in Dana's relationship with Kevin, around the time they decide to get married. There's discussion of the two of them expressing their intentions to marry to their families and the families' reactions. Both families are not really open or welcoming to this relationship, but for somewhat different reasons. The gist of it with Dana's family is that they're Black. They don't approve of her marrying this white guy. Her uncle, who has come to view her as his child, views it as a rejection of him. He hoped that she would certainly get married one day, but just assumed that she would marry a Black man. And Kevin's sister hoped that he would marry, but in keeping with the times, he feels it might not necessarily be his sister's views, but more so her being influenced by her husband. She's really not open to and quite hostile towards Dana, right? In that she actually even refuses to meet her. I can think of few things worse than slavery. But in going back to the past, Dana initially starts out by considering all the pros of her time period and juxtaposing that to the 1800s. There's certainly been some progress by that time, but the reality is that things still aren't perfect in her time period. There are things that she can teach Rufus, things that she can express to him. But even during her time, race is still a problem. Both her and Kevin are influenced by their experiences, them having grown up during the time that they did. There's an exchange that's actually quite telling. It's a chapter in the book called The Argument, where she explains them breaking to their families, or rather explaining to their families that they're planning to get married, and their family's rejection of the relationship, which really just serves to bring them closer together. But something that kind of stood out to me was Dana recounting an argument with Kevin where he's waiting tables and whatnot, working on this script. He asked her to type it up for him, right? She'd been achieving a bit of success more earlier than he had, right? Around the time they met. But they were still both working towards making it. And he says in a joking way that when they get married, she'll focus on being his wife. And so, he asks if she can help type up this manuscript. She kind of just takes it as a joke until he actually asks her seriously to type up the manuscript. It turns into an argument where he becomes quite upset, right? She's like, let this slide. But then he does as well, but then he becomes angry, right? And, especially when she continues to refuse typing the manuscript. Here it is that both of them are writers. They're pursuing this dream of earning a living as writers, using their creative talents and abilities. But it's like, he's not dismissive of her goals, but he doesn't quite take it as seriously as his own writing. He takes offense at Dana not being willing to help him, right? He just assumes that she should be willing to take her time away from her projects to type up his manuscript, which she explains that she doesn't like typing, right? His expectation is that he asks, and so she just should. it's probably not intended that way on his part, but it comes across as being a bit sexist. They're both working towards their independent goals of achieving success as writers, but he thinks nothing of asking her to essentially function as his assistant. The way that his anger escalates, it's concerning. You're a writer. She's a writer as well. If you need help with your typing, either you do it yourself or you hire someone to do it. Especially because there's no quid pro quo. Not like, type my manuscript for me and I'll type yours for you. It's more so like, you're the woman in my life, you're my partner, and I expect you to support me in my dreams in essentially functioning as my assistant. But I don't expect to support you in the same way. And so, while the two of them are now in the past, she's out here trying to struggle and survive as a slave because she's black. And because he's white, he has some degree of privilege and kind of gets used to it, right? Their experiences during that time period are just completely different. He's oblivious to some of her experiences, and she tries to explain things to Kevin. He's actually having fun back in the past. And she's trying to avoid the mistress of the house, meaning Rufus's mother, who's giving her a hard time, like slapping her about the place, getting whipped by the man of the house, meaning Rufus's father. And so during the first interaction between Dana and Rufus, where he's a young man, it's obvious that at this point, he's now well on his path to becoming the unfortunate jerk that she'd been trying to help him avoid. He's given to drinking. Alice has also, they're both older now. They're in their late teens or so. And at this point, attraction and things like that are coming into play. But the attraction is one-sided. And in this unbalanced environment, it's dangerous because Rufus is attracted while Alice is uninterested. And so he uses his privilege and power, his authority, to take advantage of his attraction and interest in Alice. And in this environment, that's dangerous, as the one who's attracted is Rufus, while Alice is uninterested. He uses his privilege, power, and authority to take advantage of his attraction and interest in Alice. Some of the people we knew earlier in the book who were quite young, are now older. And so the happenings of slavery are coming into play, the full happenings of it, as they're now becoming young adults, right? And so with that, you now have power, authority, the full extent of slavery on display. Something that I took issue with was, fine, from his perspective, he viewed it as he was in love with Alice. At this point, Alice most likely just saw Rufus as a friend, but she'd met someone else and fallen in love with this guy. And the other guy was black, right? He's a slave. And because of that rejection, Rufus took offense, because here it is that he's a slave-owning man, maybe not necessarily rich, but far better off than this other black guy, at least from a financial standpoint. And yet Alice has no romantic interest in him. His pride is bruised, and he either rapes or attempted to rape Alice. But either way, it comes from a place of power and ego, which I think Butler does a good job of describing here, right? The underlying motivation, where it was certainly an act of power. He states that he's been attracted to Alice for a while, and if he was just after having sexual intercourse with her, he could have, just attacked her a long time ago. But instead, he tried to charm her, and failing that, he's now committed this terrible act of violence against her, right? He words it as it being an act of passion, which rape most certainly is not. Initially, I kind of saw it as a sign of the misguided times, right? Where with this being the 70s, such a crime might have been viewed as a crime of passion rather than an act of power. In reading Kindred, in one sense, it kind of reminded me of books like Gulliver's Travel or A Yankee in King Arthur's Court, where it's one thing to read a book about the past, right? A book about history versus even experiencing it for yourself. And most of us pretty much would never have this experience, right? Unless you live a long life. We're not back in none of us were really around in the 1800s. But with these kinds of books, it's like an imagining of what it might have been like for a person from your time to go back into the past where they could share their experiences, as well as what the future is like with these people, right? They could see and experience the reality of living at a specific time in the past. Now, this is very much a book for adults, right? As the themes are rather adult. I don't think this is a book you would necessarily read to a child, but I thought it was pretty interesting because as a kid, I really liked Gulliver's Travel. And sometime after I read A Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and I liked both books. I thought this book was kind of weird, and I found myself frustrated at points, not so much with the writing style, but just with the decisions that some of the characters made. I don't want to give the story away, but I actually grew to really enjoy the book. It's different from what I'm used to reading, but I enjoyed it quite a bit. One of the things that stood out to me, though, which kind of happened throughout the book, was like, the characters would do things and I would have like an observation about it internally, only to then maybe like a chapter or so later, like one of the characters would speak my exact thoughts. So the author, Butler, is very aware of these things. Like, she's not at all oblivious to some of the characters' shortcomings or observations that you as the reader might make. It shows you how masterful a storyteller Butler was, because she was able to craft these stories and knew exactly what your thought process and feelings would be along the way. And so it's manipulative, yes, but like in a good way. It's like, I know exactly how you're going to feel at this point. I know how to toy with your thoughts and emotions, how to move you along on this journey. So, for example, a thing that stood out to me throughout the book and actually made me frustrated with Dana, right, was dealing with Rufus, right? She tries, right? But he always turns around and does something to just really set back these efforts. He apologizes, promises to do better, but it's like as he gets older and gets more set in his ways, it just starts to feel like a lost cause. It's a Sisyphean task where it's like, you're just going to be at this forever. And whatever progress you think you might make, give it a few days, or by the time she returns from the future, it's like you're back where you were before, if not worse off. And so as he gets older, he shows himself to be like a truly vile individual. And it's a matter of the times he lives in, but he has every opportunity with the foresight and information provided by Dana to do better. He just chooses not to. He makes a lot of excuses. He doesn't know how to treat people. He has this fear of people leaving him, and to get around that fear, Rufus ends up trying to control them, forcing them into staying with him. So it's like, you see little traces of this when he's younger, but it becomes even more apparent as he gets older and now exerts some control over the people in the plantation. And really, his idea of love, like, he expresses it as such, right? But his idea of love and having a relationship is actually abuse. Even in his treatment of Alice, who's this woman he claims to love and wants to be with, but then for whatever reason or due to whatever frustrations, which is really just her not loving him, or despite them having been friends as children, he becomes violent with her. So here's this woman he claims to love or believes he loves, but then he hurts her in the process. With Dana, he realizes how important she is to him in his survival, but then he does things. He's selfish and does things to push her away, and is then upset that she keeps him at a distance, or that she becomes upset with him. It's like he has a terrible inability to properly relate to people. It's just selfishness on his part. Certainly, he's a product of his time, and this is the environment he's grown up in. But that's the case for everyone, right? Dana excuses a lot of his bad behavior, which, if you think of it, it reminded me of like an abusive relationship, right? This person that does things to hurt you, then they always have some excuse as to why what you did caused them to lose control. And in his moment of rage, he has no concern for her well-being or anyone else's. But then when he calms down, it's like he has these kind gestures and whatnot. He says nice things. He's apologetic, but give it a little bit of time, and the next time he gets upset, it's the same thing all over again. So there's no real change. It's extremely frustrating because Dana is just enduring this, right? Putting up with this abuse, and the people around her as well. Dana at least has the option where every now and then she goes back to her time and has like a little break. She saves this guy's life. She comes back, and each and every time she endures some act of violence or something bad happens to her. And it's like bad things are also happening to the enslaved people around her as well, right? Due to Rufus and the others. It's a creative way of, getting people to put themselves into the shoes of this woman, right? Imagining time traveling with her, bearing witness to her experiences and thus what it might have been like to be alive at that time. Being in the big house, working out in the kitchen, working out in the field, having to deal with an overseer, having to deal with a master that needs and is reliant on you. Like his survival is based on you and your work, but at the same time, he treats you as less than a human. In that fight to survive, because her needs are tied up with Rufus, sometimes she did things or went along with things, assisted him in ways that were detrimental to the enslaved people around them. And that was kind of hard to bear witness to. It's not that she wanted to, but her interest, her own humanity was aligned with the people who were enslaved, but her interests were, because of this tie to Rufus, her interests were aligned with him, right? Helping to keep him alive. It leads to some pretty interesting conversations. Imagine yourself in the shoes of these different characters. What course of action would you take stuck between one bad choice and another bad decision? I like that aspect of the book because it makes you question yourself. So often it's easy to say, well, if I was alive back then, I would do blah, 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 blah. But I think the book it takes a different perspective, right? Allows you to take a deeper look and ask deeper questions about some of these assumptions that we make. I'm not big on science fiction and time travel, fantasy and whatnot, but I ended up really enjoying Kindred. I think it's because in part the time travel was more a creative device, right? As it ended up not being so distracting or as big a factor, right? It was more so a motivation for the character. It helps move the story along, but it didn't really dominate the story. It's not like a book with like magic and spells and things like that. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.